All right, hi Sydney, Mike here, and this is Dave, my good buddy Dave. He's going to, well, walk us through his Canon camera, but also talk mainly about what yours does, and of course about this lens. So go ahead, Dave. Let's talk about the lens. What's going to happen here when she uses it?
Well, it's a wonderful lens. It's an 85 millimeter. One thing that Mike and I talked about that you need to be aware of is on your camera, which is a lot like my camera, you have what's called an APS-C type imager, which means that this lens will bolt right on. It's going to be sharp, it's going to be crisp, it's going to be great, but it's actually going to act like a 105 millimeter. So you'll hear 85, just be aware that it's going to make it act a little bit longer, but that's still a wonderful lens for portraits.
All right, so the next part, I mean, Sydney, we know you've taken a lot of pictures already, and probably lots of portraits even, but of course not with this new lens. So what do we need to know about the settings? Like what are some of the preferences or ideal settings, you think, for this kind of lens?
Well, the nice thing is this is considered a prime lens, so it's an 85 millimeter lens. It doesn't zoom. That makes it extra sharp. So there's really no settings you have to worry about except for the aperture. And the aperture is what is the other really nice thing about this lens. It's considered a very fast lens because it's an 85 millimeter 1.8. By it being a 1.8, they refer to that as being fast because it gives you a very wide opening, and that wide opening will allow you to use faster shutter speeds, which therefore also makes sense that in low light you'll be able to use a faster shutter speed than you would with a lens that isn't quite so fast. So the lens is going to be really good in dark situations, and it's also going to give you the ability to control your depth of field really, really well. And that's the key, both between this lens's focal length being that 85 to 105 range. It's going to make your image flatten slightly, which is very flattering to looking at people. You've seen the wide angle lens with their big nose and stuff. That's not very flattering. This lens is going to flatten that image a little bit, be much more flattering for portraits. And then what the 1.8 will do, and the 2.8 and all the other low aperture settings, is it's going to allow you to control your depth of field. And at 1.8, this lens has a very, very, very shallow depth of field. So much so that if you were to take a picture of Mike with this lens at 1.8, he could physically, your photograph could actually have his nose in focus and his eyes out of focus. So be aware that that 1.8 is a tool that you can use. It's really fun because at 1.8 or 2.8, you shoot a picture of Mike right here. This is going to be in focus. All this stuff back here, out of focus. It's all going to be stuff that you're not worried about in a portrait because you want to see this guy, scary as he is, but you don't want that stuff in focus. 1.8 is going to allow you to focus right here. This is going to be fuzzy. This is going to be fuzzy. So that's what makes a fast lens really cool to work with.
Next thing, how about ISO? Any recommendations with those kinds of settings?
That's mostly preference. The cool thing is with these modern cameras, your 80 that you have, the ISO settings, you've got quite a bit of range that are going to keep the image really sharp. I used to be, and still am, a big proponent of shooting at the lowest ISO you can because you just want to keep the noise to a minimum. It's going to make your images sharper. It's going to keep the contrast range.
So
really
when you
nice.
say lowest you can, what do you think? What kind of range?
Well, I usually leave mine at 100 or 160.
Really? Okay. So even in low light?
Yeah, but then the problem is in low light you're going to need a tripod.
Right.
But these things are so good. Really, it's the image that's more important. So if you got to jack it up to 600 or even 1200, you can get away with it nowadays.
Right.
So really, it's what you need. And we've got a friend, Mimi Jung, who shoots wonderful portraits.
Right.
She will shoot ISO 3200 because she wants to click that image and get it.
Right.
The image is way more important than any kind of grain you might get in there. And again, you're talking about grain with these new cameras.
In fact, I think, because when I was visiting you, Sydney, we talked a little bit about ISO, and I kind of led her that direction too, to the faster speeds. But you're still saying, even in low light, if you do put it on the tripod, then that way you'll get the greater detail. But you have to have the tripod, of course, for the stabilizing.
For the stabilizing. I've shot my grandson quite a bit, and unfortunately, he's constantly moving. And that's another issue you have when you're shooting at a really slow shutter speed. So if you're getting people that are moving, jack that ISO up, because then you're going to get a faster shutter speed. And then using that fast lens, between the fast lens speed and a higher ISO, you're going to get a faster shutter speed, which is going to freeze things a lot better. And one other thing you might want to do, and this is not expensive at all, look at that. This is something that I like to do. You can buy the Canon one, but you can buy one like this for like $5. A lens shade is a good idea.
Now, real quick on those. Obviously, those are a little bit of a problem when you're shooting wide angle, but they're not a problem in this situation.
Because
right?
this lens is a prime lens and it's static, it's never going to interfere unless your hands tend to go like that or something. But the nice thing about a rubber lens shade is it also absorbs a little shock. So I always like to have a lens shade on my camera.
So you like that because, how come?
If you're shooting in a situation where your light source, and in our little kitchen here, you've got some light that's coming in at an angle, without the lens shade on there, that light is going to be able to refract ever so slightly off the elements, and you'll get some artifacts in your image. You've seen them, the little half moons or a little flare, a little lens flare. You put on a lens shade like this, which again, relatively cheap, and it acts as a little bit of a protector, but now those light sources aren't going to be able to get to your lens and refract off those elements and cause those little artifacts. So just handy to have, especially if you've got the sun at a pretty steep angle on a picture. It's going to create all kinds of weirdness in your glass, whereas this is going to keep most of that stuff out of your picture.
Pretty good. All right, so we've talked, Sydney, about your specific lens. We're going to take advantage of Dave's expertise with Canon cameras because he's had them for a long time.
See, I like Canon. This is my, well, let's just say I've had a few Canons. This is my most recent. It's a 7D Mark II. I have a 5D Mark II, but this is how long I've had Canons. This is my first Canon camera. It's an FTB that I got when I was 14 years old. And I guess you could say this kind of started it. This has a 50mm lens. And again, it's a 1.8, so a good fast lens on a film camera. But that's how much I like Canon.
It's so awesome to see your first camera. Can you give me just a little overview, though, about what the digital cameras can do today? Especially hers, the 80. Maybe you could even just talk a little bit about the 80.
As you know, these things are computers. They really, really are. And you have the ability to change so many things inside the camera now. You've got your standard shutter and aperture controls, which are the most important parts. I don't know if you like to shoot in manual or shutter priority or aperture priority or program, but those are the ones that I always use. I don't ever put this in auto. It's an amazing camera in auto. This thing, it's hard to take a bad picture in auto, but I like the ability to control the depth of field, which you do with your aperture, control the sharpness with your shutter speed, and of course if you're in manual, you control both of those at the same time, but the computer, the light meter, will tell you how to set that up.
My son Liam, who Sydney is well aware of and knows that he takes a lot of pictures too, he takes a lot of pictures for his yearbook, and I know one of the things he's told me is, yes, he likes manual settings too, but he's talked about how, like in the sports mode, sometimes he's used that a lot, even for portraits, because sometimes it more like the type we were talking about with Mimi, the quickness. But maybe some of those automatic settings, though, you can use occasionally as a bit of a trick or
there's a reason,
cheat a little bit. Yeah.
There's a reason those automatic settings are there, and a lot of the sports guys that we work with the Seattle Times and the PI, I don't know, will use the sort of a semi-automatic setting because it allows the camera to really focus quick and get those images. And you're right, the automatic settings are a good way, especially as a street shooter. You've heard the term street shooting, like Ernst Haas and those folks. In auto, the camera's always ready. So in that respect, automatic mode is awesome.
It can be used effectively.
But when you want to be deliberate, when you want to be shooting some art, when you want to be shooting a portrait that you've got time to take, to really do the way you want, then you get into those manual settings, and that gives you the creative ability to control.
One other thing, and then we'll wrap it up. How about lighting? Any tips on lighting in any number of situations? Is there any tips for lighting? And I don't necessarily mean, expensive kits you need to buy or whatever, but just how to use lighting a little bit. Lighting
is the key. Light. What are we doing? We're capturing light. and it's how the light falls on that little imager and makes those pixels do what they do. That is really what photography is all about. And so lighting is so variable, just depending on where your source is. Of course, the biggest light source that we live with is the sun. Where that sun is in relation to your picture is going to make a difference on how your shot's going to look. If that sun's back here, boom, it's going to be so bright. But maybe we can work with that silhouette that Mike's become. If the lighting is from the side, it's going to be a much more harsh, but it's going to create contours. Coming from the side, what it does is it creates those shadows in those different contours of a person's face or in a mountain or whatever. Whereas the lighting right there coming from behind you, coming from behind the camera, boom, it's going to make your image the star, and it's going to create the most even lighting. And of course, in a portrait picture, that's the most flattering lighting. So a light source that's just a little bit from, you've heard about putting the sun over your shoulder. That's real common because that's going to be the most flattering light on people. But when you move that light source around, and remember we're talking about light bulbs or the sun or a street light
or a reflector, maybe.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
And that's the other thing is we've been talking about pretty harsh light sources, the bright sun, the light bulb. When you get into a cloudy day, the light becomes diffuse, and that's very flattering too. So diffuse lighting is another source of lighting that you want to use. If you've got a friend that you want to take a picture of, but the sun is like coming up here, which is really lousy lighting usually, but you're at a park, take him under a tree or take him around a corner in the shadow. That light's going to be much more soft and
Liam
diffuse.
does that a lot. He likes to do that. My son likes to do these portraits where he takes them somewhere outside in a specific location, like a tree or under a lamppost. Yeah. So that's kind of what he does too.
So the harsh light's cool, and it's going to be really contrasty and neat. But if you want to soften it up for a person, take them around the corner, still lean them toward the sky, so that the sky is the primary light source. But now the light's much more diffuse, and instead of a bright face and a shadow, you're going to get a much more nice diffuse look. So lighting is huge.
It's huge in portrait photography, in all photography, but especially in portrait.
It's all light is what we're trying to capture.
Right. All right. Well, there you go. Some tips from my friend Dave Wyke, who knows his stuff when it comes to photography.
Sorry if I rambled.